If you look at somebody that's eating a bunch of meat and a bunch of cheese, it's easy to categorize them into a group that's going to be insulin resistant and metabolically unhealthy, but we're failing to look at a big global picture. What are these people probably combining along with this meat and cheese? Probably hyperpalatable garbage, probably refined starches, probably a lot of sugar, right? Very seldom do you come across people that are eating wholesome animal products without the addition of hyperpalatable processed garbage. Now, without giving this entire video away, let's break down the best kind of meats, the best kinds of cheeses that you can eat to improve insulin resistance. Now, before I get down to the very specific foods, we do have to understand the mechanisms. That's how this channel works. There's timestamps in this video. If you need to skip ahead, you're short on time, but I encourage you to get the education along with it. Let's jump in. First, we have to look at red meat versus dairy. Which one is better for insulin resistance? Which one's worse? For that, we look at a study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. It took a look at a high dairy diet compared to a high red meat diet. The dairy diet was allowed to add chicken and fish to increase the protein content. Long story short, what they found is that the high dairy diet ended up having decreases in insulin sensitivity. In other words, their insulin resistance got worse. They also found their fasting insulin was higher. So when you look at this at first glance, you think it's really bad. In fact, when you look at the women in the studies, the women had a 14.7% decrease in their insulin sensitivity. So it was markedly worse for women than it was for men. But does this mean that dairy is a full-fledged problem? No, because there's some flaws to this, okay? First of all, with this study, we have to remember that milk has a lot of sugar. So if they were just allowed to eat whatever dairy they want, no one knows if they had way too much milk versus cheese. There's a lot of nuance with dairy, which is what I hope to break down with this video to teach you what to eat, right? So they could have been consuming a bunch of milk that has a ton of sugar in it when it adds up. They also knew that they were writing down their own foods, right? So they could have been consuming yogurt as dairy, and they were getting like a Dannon Light and Fit yogurt that has like 30 grams of sugar added to it. So it's not necessarily a totally fair assessment. But we look at another study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it paints a little bit more of a picture as to what might have happened. Dairy is pretty insulinogenic. Now, what that means is dairy spikes insulin quite a bit. Why does it spike insulin? Well, it's predominantly the whey protein that spikes insulin. Whey spikes insulin quite a bit, and whey is in a good number of dairy products. Obviously whey protein, but milk has a lot of whey in it as well, right? So what do we do in this case? Well, if you're really walking that line down being insulin resistant, you may want to consider reducing the dairy that has a lot of whey in it. But I gotta be honest here, the whole thing with whey being insulinogenic does not have me sold entirely, because the insulin spike that comes along with whey is also spiking another hormone called glucagon, which counterbalances it. It's called the insulin to glucagon ratio, and it's complex, and we don't need to go into it here. The point is that if you're extra concerned, you can still have dairy, maybe just reduce the milk, maybe don't have the whey protein, and just look around for dairy that is a little less in whey. So with that, you might want to opt for the cheeses that are going to be things like Parmesan cheese, the aged cheeses like Pecorino Romano. You're going to want to go for the goat cheese, for the feta, things like that. Aged Gouda is also really good. Aged Swiss is also really good. So there's a few cheeses, but don't worry, I have more. So now we need to answer the saturated fat question, because I know people are going to bring it up. Does saturated fat negatively influence the insulin sensitivity when it comes from dairy? Well, with that, we look at some more data. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition published a paper that ultimately demonstrated that as long as saturated fat is not overconsumed, it's not going to pose a negative effect. So in other words, as long as you're not sitting there eating ridiculous amounts alongside a bunch of sugar too, you're probably not going to have an issue with it. But we look at another study that was published in Diabetologia that took a look at monounsaturated fats compared to saturated fats, and they found that monounsaturated fats improved insulin sensitivity just a little bit more than saturated fats. So in that case, yeah, it's probably best to maybe opt for like an olive oil or an avocado oil or a macadamia nut oil instead of maybe just a bunch of cheese. But what this study did point out is that as long as it was under a 37% mean of dietary fat, and what that simply means is they weren't looking at overconsumption. The bottom line here is overconsumption is always going to be a problem. So if you're trying to control insulin resistance and you're overdoing the cheese and you're going crazy on it and consuming a ton of it, it's still going to be a problem. Too many calories leads to too much inflammation, which leads to insulin resistance. So dairy is not your problem. Overeating the dairy is. Meat is not your problem. Overeating a bunch of other stuff with the meat is probably the problem. I actually find it pretty hard to overeat meat, for the record. Now we're going to dive into the meat section and specifically which meats you should eat. But we're also going to come up with a few more components of dairy that you want to pay attention to, and therefore giving you a few more kinds of dairy to add. So by the end of this, you're going to have a nice spectrum of meats and cheeses to add to your diet to potentially improve insulin resistance. I popped a link down below for Thrive Market. So if you're trying to revamp your diet a little bit, I think it's a good place to start. There's a 30% off link. So you save 30% off your entire grocery order. They're a sponsor on this channel, so they allow us to create this content, but also they give you a really good deal, 30% off your entire grocery order. So you can sort by low carb, and you can sort by cheese snacks. So you can get things like Parmesan crisps if you're looking to kind of snack on something that's lower carb. And then meat snacks, you can get chomp sticks, you can get epic bars, like venison, things like that. It's, well, epic. Anyway, that link down below saves you 30% off your entire first grocery order, plus you get a free $50 gift when you use my custom link down below in the description. So again, not pushing anything on you. They're a great sponsor in this channel, and I think that you'll get a lot of value out of it. So that link's down below in the description. Okay, so let's talk meat for a second. Let's say you are getting really, really into exercise. You're exercising a lot, but then someone tells you, well, you don't want to eat a lot of meat because meat's going to be a problem. It's going to be bad for your heart. It's carcinogenic and all this and that. Well, there's a study that was published in the Frontiers of Cardiovascular Medicine that was very interesting. It found that when subjects consumed a high protein diet alongside exercise, that it was better than exercise alone for a number of different things. It decreased their inflammation, it decreased their triglycerides, and it improved their insulin sensitivity, decreased insulin resistance. Better than just exercise alone. So exercise plus a good amount of protein is more beneficial than just exercise. Okay, so now what proteins should we eat? Well, with this, we look at the CLA data. What the heck is CLA? Conjugated linoleic acid. Well, what the heck is that? Well, it's something that we probably know mostly as a supplement. Okay, we've talked about CLA on this channel before, good and bad. And the older research looks at CLA and says, oh, well, CLA is a problem. It's going to actually make insulin resistance worse. But when you look at the newer data that has better study design and better processes, you actually see something quite different. Now, why am I talking CLA? Well, CLA is in dairy and CLA is in meat, but it's higher in specific kinds, which we're going to get to in a second. So there was a cool study that found that CLA alongside exercise was better at improving insulin resistance than exercise alone. And then they also found that CLA in a sedentary individual was better than just being sedentary alone. So CLA improves exercise groups and non-exercise groups as far as insulin resistance is concerned. But you're probably wondering, well, why and how much should I take? I don't recommend you go out and buy a CLA supplement. I don't think that's the way to go. I'm not a big supplement guy. The mechanism is interesting. It seems to increase the expression of what are called GLUT4 and PPARY. In English, these are things that are directly related with insulin sensitivity and glucose uptake. So it encourages the gene expression at a genetic level to create more of this. So, Thomas, what are we supposed to eat? Well, we want to focus on things like beef and relatively leaner cuts of beef. So we're just getting high amount of protein to CLA ratio. So I recommend things like a filet, maybe a leaner New York, things like that. A flank steak is also really good. You could still go for the fattier cuts, but just don't overdo them because the calories add up. Okay. Now, the other ones, lamb. I know it's expensive, mutton's expensive too, but they're very good sources of CLA. So even though pricey, they might be worth it. Also, then we want to look at things like venison. Remember, venison is going to be like one of the leanest types of red meat. I love venison because I love red meat, because I love the hemi-iron, but I don't always want the copious amounts of calories that are coming with like a beautiful tomahawk ribeye, which I love, but I'm not about to pound 2,000 calories in a ribeye, right? So I love venison for that reason. So those are the kinds of protein that are going to be the best. It does not mean that chicken and leaner cuts are bad at all. They're great. You should definitely add them. But these are the highest in CLA. And as far as the dairy, in addition to the ones that I mentioned earlier, like the Parmesan, the Pecorino Romano, the aged Gouda, we also want to focus on blue cheese that's been aged, like maybe a Roquefort, okay? That's going to be super high in CLA. Aged brie is going to be very high in CLA as well. And Swiss cheese is going to be very high in CLA. So we've got a nice mix of dairies that we can have here. It's also important to mention that fatty fish with omega-3s are one of the best foods you can eat for insulin sensitivity too. It's still a meat, okay? Study published in Diabetologia took a look at 324 participants. Wild stuff. They had them eat no fish, lean fish, fatty fish, or omega-3 supplementation. They found the higher the omega-3s, the better the insulin sensitivity, even if it was from supplement form. So if you don't like fish, taking a fish oil pill might not be a bad idea. I do occasionally recommend that. I typically recommend cod liver oil, but that's neither here nor there. We don't have to get into the details here. I'm going to save you the time. Let's snapshot what I talked about here. Okay, increase your proportion of things like venison, lean red meat, things like lamb, things like mutton when you can, okay? Game meat in general is generally really good. Increase your fish consumption as a protein source when you can. Increase your dairy consumption of things like Greek yogurt that's unsweetened, cottage cheese, which are going to be low whey, so they're going to be lower insulin spike, okay? And the cheeses, as far as what you want for the fats there, well, you can go for like heavy cream for one. That's going to be not very insulinogenic, okay? Half and half is still going to have the milk in it. It's going to be somewhat insulinogenic. Better to go for the heavy cream in that case, okay? And for the cheese, Roquefort, blue cheese, brie. We want things like Swiss. We want the Parmesan. We want the Pecorino Romano, the feta, and the goat, okay? As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.